Well, welcome everybody tonight. My name is Mark Graham. I'm an assistant professor of theology and religious studies in the Theology and Religious Studies Department at Villanova University. And also I'm the co-chair of the Villanova University Task Force on the Sexual Abuse Crisis in the Catholic Church. Task Force sponsors a number of webinars every semester. And this semester we are just giddy with excitement to have Eliana Dockterman join us. Eliana is a staff writer at Time Magazine, Gender, Culture, and Society. Much of her work has been focused on abuse, harassment, and rape. She was also the co-author of Time's 2017 Person of the Year story on the Silence Breakers, who launched the Me Too movement. In addition to her lengthy feature on sexual abuse in the Boy Scouts, she has written many cover stories for Time Magazine on gender and society, including an investigation into the effectiveness of court-mandated gender therapy, and a story on why survivors like Christine Blasey Ford still haven't managed meaningful change long after Me Too went viral. So it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us tonight, Eliana Dockterman. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I will go ahead and talk a little bit about the reporting that I did on sex abuse in the Boy Scouts, and then maybe with question and answer, we can dive into the parallels a little bit more. But basically, the story came to my attention because at the time, several dozen and what became several hundred men and boys were joining in what was either going to be a class action suit, and then once the Boy Scouts declared bankruptcy, a suit to try to participate in the bankruptcy proceedings by the lawyers who were representing these men. So there was a group of lawyers who particularly started a campaign, Abused in Scouting, had a website, were advertising in specific areas around the country, but they were not as much of a sort of like national presence as they ended up being at the time. So one of their attorneys who I had previously worked with on cases of sexual abuse, specifically with women being harassed and raped in the workplace, reached out to me and said, I'm working with a few other lawyers on this case, and is this something you'd be interested in reporting on? And my background has largely been on focusing, frankly, on abuse of women, specifically in the workplace, but also outside the workplace, and much more of sort of a feminist and female lens on the topic. And this was sort of the second time that I had looked into abuse in the majority of cases, in this case, of boys and men. And that was enlightening for me in a lot of ways, because there is obviously, as I'm sure you've talked about with other guests in these seminars before, a lot of sort of cultural influences, specifically on boys and men, that aren't quite the same for women and girls when it comes to sexual abuse. There's a lot of shaming, and boys and men are just much less likely to share what's happened to them, especially in the immediacy of what's happened to them with people they know, let alone the authorities. And there have been several studies that show now that, men sometimes wait decades to report abuse. And that complicates things for a lot of reasons, in part legally, because before the Me Too movement, and now this has changed in some states, but not others, the statute of limitations on these cases is very limited. So for many of the boys and men I talked to, had they, reported to the police decades later, they wouldn't have been able to find any restitution, though that was the only time that they felt comfortable coming forward. A lot of the shaming that's happening is around these sort of entrenched ideas of masculinity. There's obviously homophobia at play, and just a general sense of this is not something that a man lets happen to him. And the fear, especially in these adolescent boys, that they are not sort of living up to what the standard of a man as it has been conceived should be, if they are vulnerable in any way. So it was definitely interesting to talk to these men about why they were coming forward now. It was a combination of factors. The first was this was in the first year or two after the Me Too movement. And certainly the fact that so many women at the beginning of that movement had come forward was influential. But also there were several men who came forward in the Me Too movement. Someone like Terry Crews, who is an actor who has been on many cop shows, is known for just being this like very physically imposing guy, this very strong guy, came forward about being abused by an agent in Hollywood. And I think that when men began talking publicly, men like him especially began talking publicly about experiencing that abuse, some of those notions at least began to crack a little about who is abused and who isn't, and what that, sort of says about you. And again, this is something that's all often happening internally. And obviously because of like societal expectations and pressures. But I think the fact that someone like Terry Crews could speak up about that, and the ramifications were such that that agent not only lost his job, but that other men spoke out about their experiences as well, sort of showed people that this is a common thing that happens to men as well. I made it more acceptable to talk about. So I think there was that. The other factor in this case was that the Boy Scouts were already in the midst of several Me Too and scandals that dated frankly before Me Too, of sexual abuse. This was a running problem, and their insurers were basically saying that we cannot keep paying out these claims. And there have been so many of them. You did not sort of adhere to the contract that they had with the insurers, saying that they would create a safe environment for these boys, because they didn't. So the result of which is that the Boy Scouts were imminently going to declare bankruptcy. And because of that, when the Boy Scouts declared bankruptcy and the bankruptcy proceedings happened, anyone who had a claim against the Boy Scouts organization, this was going to be their last time to make that claim. So there was really this swell of support of this is your last and only chance to make a claim. And the men and boys that I spoke to ranged in ages from, I believe, 10 to in their 80s. So this is something that had been going on for a long time and had not ended, by virtue of the fact that I spoke to somebody who had experienced the abuse within the last year at the Boy Scouts. And I think that the other sort of point that I would like to hit on is that the sense of betrayal, especially among parents that I talk to for these young boys, that they had put so much faith in an institution to care for and look after their sons and instill in their sons certain values, and then to feel betrayed that the organization not only did not meet those expectations, but actively hurt their sons. I think that, it erodes it erodes parents' trust in general as to sort of how they can navigate the world with their children. And I spoke to parents who were saying, if this can happen in the Boy Scouts, and I was a Boy Scout when I was a kid, or my husband was a Boy Scout when they were a kid, like, can this happen in schools? Can this happen in religious settings? Like, where can I feel safe with my kid? And I think that there is a certain amount of, obviously these cases are still rare, but you could see how like there's this panic that spreads through parents when something like this comes to light. And with the Boy Scouts especially, they were connected so directly with a lot of religious organizations where people had fostered their communities. I think especially in this case, and this is something that like would take a little time to unpack, but like the Mormon Church very closely aligned with the Boy Scouts in many cases, and extremely close-knit communities. I think that, you know, by association, that can also have ramifications on the entire community, but also on sort of those religious centers too, where people turn to for moral guidance. And I think in that way, honestly, it's not that dissimilar from the Catholic Church. I think also the Boy Scouts are chartered by Congress, so they are also extremely closely associated with the American government, with like sort of concepts that we hold dear as Americans. They have very much sort of billed themselves in this patriotic light. And I think that, again, something like this happening erodes people's confidence in institutions. And, you know, not to get like 2,000 miles above the earth here, but I do think that we are facing in America a crisis of trust in institutions right now, on, you know, regardless of where you land politically, religiously, culturally, whatever. I think that people mistrust often the institutions, the government bodies, lots of places that they used to depend on for safety and information. And I think that one of the things that we have to reckon with is that we're in an era where truths that were long hidden in order to sustain that trust have come to light. And how do we sort of both acknowledge the truth of what is happening, repair it, but also repair that broken trust? And I think that that is sort of a difficult thing to navigate in a way that doesn't automatically sort of, I think in some cases, institutions, and just to like speak sort of hypothetically here, like for example, a workplace might respond to a bunch of sexual harassment claims, for instance, by trying to keep the status quo, try to tamp things down, try to not acknowledge that things fundamentally need to change to address these issues, or even if they were far in the past, to acknowledge what happened and provide some sort of restitution to victims and survivors. And that's a mistake, because I think it just seeds this mistrust longer and longer, and eventually the dam is going to break. And so I think at the same time, knowing that the dam is going to break, the question sort of becomes what is the best way to go about addressing and fixing these issues and making sure that you can earn people's trust back. And I think that largely I'm someone who believes that things happen from the top down, that, you know, while something like the Me Too movement, something like this group of Boy Scouts coming together to bring this lawsuit was sort of a bottom-up movement of, you know, saying enough is enough with the way that the system works, and we need to overthrow the system. For sustained change to take place, I do think that there needs to be an acknowledgement from the top down that the problem exists, the problem is acknowledged, and let's begin the conversation of how to fix the problem. And I think that does need to be a dialogue, but we can't just sort of lay the problem at the feet of the survivors to fix. It needs to be a conversation between the people who are identifying this problem and the people who are responsible for fixing it. And I say responsible because I do genuinely believe that people who run institutions hold that responsibility, not the survivors. And too often the responsibility falls on the survivors. And it is extremely difficult as a survivor to come forward, as I sort of alluded to earlier, but especially with the press, for instance. You are literally airing the most private, vulnerable, horrible parts of your life to the public in a way that, you know, when I speak to people for these types of stories, I say to them, you know, I think that your story is powerful. I think that other people who have experienced it will feel like they are not alone when they read your story. And that's why it's important to share sort of the specific things that happened and how it happens, because I think people connect to those details more than they do an abstract idea. But doing all of that takes a lot of personal sacrifice and difficulty. And I think that, I think this is really great because this is part of a conversation and dialogue that is happening to sort of not only talk about the existence of the problem, but the solutions as well, hopefully, and to not just overburden people who are frankly psychologically scarred by what happened to them, with finding the solutions themselves. In terms of the Boy Scouts specifically, I mean, I don't know how much it's worth digging into this, but like I've been fairly disappointed with how they have responded thus far to everything that has happened, which has largely been sort of PR campaigns of like letting girls participate in the Boy Scouts so they can get some good PR out of that, and sort of ignoring the actual problem of what was happening in the Boy Scouts. The bankruptcy proceedings have been a little bit of a mess in that, it's always tricky to sort of say how much money should go to whom for what, and to sort of quantify the pain that has been caused to people. But at the same time, it seems to me as an outside observer, and I have not followed this sort of like filing by filing, but have been, in touch with the people involved in following the news. As outside observers, certainly seems like their priority is to make sure that they can hang on to the land and properties that they want to hang on to, and prioritize that over, frankly, in what's in their own interest, I think, of reestablishing trust with the community by acknowledging their wrongdoing, even if it's through financial restitution. So I think that, these things are complicated to figure out how to solve. I think that the thing that the men that I talked to said over and over again is, I just want to share this so there's less of a chance that it happens to someone else. And I think, hopefully, my hope is always that my work is like read and acknowledged by the people who can have some role in making sure that that doesn't happen, that it doesn't happen to someone else. But it's sort of hard to tell at this point, even a couple years out from writing, or I guess it's a year, time has no meaning anymore, a year and a half-ish since I originally wrote that piece, whether there has been any sort of fundamental shift in attitude. There certainly hasn't been like a humbling moment, at least not internally, maybe externally by virtue of them having to file for bankruptcy. But yeah, so I think that that's about all I have to say on this. And I'm happy to sort of try to connect the dots a bit more between sort of my reporting and the church. But that's sort of where I'm coming from, and sort of what I was thinking throughout that process of reporting.
Super. Thanks for your presentation. That was very informative. I appreciate that. Any of the attendees, if you want to ask Eliana a question, go ahead and type it in the chat section, and I'll go ahead and read those off as they come in. Eliana, as we're waiting for some questions to emerge, one of the things that's a big question mark in my head in terms of the Boy Scouts of America, one of the things that the Catholic bishops in the United States has done quite well, I think, is to leverage what they call the laity, right? So these are lay people, they're non-clerics, they're not priests, they're nuns, and typically they're people, Catholics in parishes who have children, right? And the Catholic bishops are relying on biological kinship and a lot of those, ferocious instincts that emerge after you have a child, to protect the child, to nurture the child, and using the laity in terms of internal and external review boards, looking over personnel decisions, setting policy on child protection agencies, so on and so forth. And what's funny with the Boy Scouts of America, I have a son who's now 19, and we never got extensively involved in the Boy Scouts of America. But the one thing that I would find odd is where you would have widespread abuse of boys when presumably most of the boys who are participating in the Boy Scouts of America have a parent and oftentimes a father, right, who is an integral part of that Boy Scouts of America experience, right? So one would think that first of all, that abuse in the Boy Scouts of America should be few and far between, because if you have fathers, they're looking out for their sons, right? You would think they'd be very protective about that. But I don't know whether that's the case. So the question mark in my head is, how could this occur when we have so many parents involved in the Boy Scouts of America in a very substantive way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. So I think that there are a couple of things. One is that a lot of the cases of abuse that I reported on happened at sort of like summer camp or retreat situations where it was one leader with a group of boys, or there was sort of a way to sort of like siphon off someone with a group leader in a situation where parents were not present. So like in a very concrete way, that sort of is when that would occur. In terms of getting parents involved and how this was possible when parents were around. I mean, I think part of it is we're talking about, I talk to men who were in the Boy Scouts in many different eras. I think when we're talking about men who experienced abuse in the 50s, I think a lot of that was just like they were not comfortable talking to their father about what was happening to them. And if a group leader, as happened in one case with one of the men that I talked to, invited him over to his house after school to like help him in tutoring, or say, you love the saxophone and I love the saxophone, and like come see this saxophone that I have at my house, things like that. Where it occurs obviously outside of the parent's vision and purview in those specific cases. And I don't think that this is isolated to just the 1950s. I think there are plenty of boys now who would be abused and just wouldn't feel comfortable bringing that up with a mother or a father or parents as to what happened to them, because the internalized misogyny of worrying about how that sort of weakness will be perceived. So I think in these cases, there's grooming happening, right? Like these abusers are training these boys to trust them almost as a parental figure themselves. So I think that is part of what's happening. But I'm enthusiastic about the notion that, having parents participate and present and conscious of what's going on in their children's lives certainly creates a scenario in which children are safer, but also establishing trust between parent and child so that a child feels comfortable bringing that information to a parent. And I'm not a family psychologist, so I'm not sure that I can speak to why that would or wouldn't happen, but I think that that's sort of the best explanation that I have.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm just going to read some of the questions in the order in which I received them. So this one reads, I think this is very helpful. I also believe it is critical for people to know that there are nearly 84,000 active claims. Boy Scouts of America has offered no reform to their youth protection program, though it's one of the survivors' demands. How do you take that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm very disappointed in the Boy Scouts' response to what has been going on. The last count I had was actually, I think, almost 93,000 claims in total in this particular lawsuit. And that was several months ago. And there also have been people who have filed individual lawsuits, criminal lawsuits. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Boy Scouts had a few very public cases of this. They said we solved this problem. It became clear that they hadn't. And they haven't offered parents reassurance as to how they're going to change their behavior moving forward. And I think that that is, you know, extremely disappointing. And I also think that one of the experts that I talked to referred to it as a rite of passage in the Boy Scouts. Like, this is how ingrained it was in the culture. So I think changing that culture is going to take just like a radical reformation of the Boy Scouts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. This is a question from the co-chair of the task force at Villanova, Massimo Fagioli. Hi, Massimo. He writes, are there parallels with other Boy Scouts associations in other countries? And in parentheses, see the report of the Royal Commission in Australia, 2013 to 2017.
I would have to look up that report specifically. I honestly, that is not something that I have looked into. My reporting has been very based in the US. I would definitely be interested to see that report. It would not shock me if this were something that were happening internationally as well.
Okay, next question from Talene. She says, you mentioned that you were disappointed in the response of the Boy Scouts in regaining trust within their communities. Have you found any groups or institutions in your reporting who did end up regaining that trust through proper work to change their prior practices?
It's a really good question. I will say that my possibly least favorite part of my job is calling the individuals or institutions who are accused of abuse for comment before a story publishes. I have yet, and I've made hundreds of these calls at this point, I have yet, and this is in the immediate aftermath, I have yet to encounter someone, and I, you know, also talk to their attorneys, sometimes friends, agents, whoever it may be. I've yet to encounter someone who didn't say something to me along the lines of like, well, this guy had one bad day. Why should he be punished for this one bad thing he did? So that's troubling. And it's been many years now. And the majority of the responses that I still get are defensive excuses. They're not even, they're just not acknowledgments. Like, I don't expect somebody to sort of pour their heart out to me on the phone or commit to doing anything. You know, sometimes you get no comments, but I've also gotten phone calls from people afterwards, basically threatening to derail other work that I'm doing because I wrote something about them or someone they know. Mm-hmm. Which is all to say that I can't think of one off the top of my head. And I do want to think a little bit more about that answer. And I do think it's possible. The other thing that I'll say, without trying to be too long-winded, is I did one other story that I wrote that is somewhat related to this is shortly after the Me Too movement went viral, and it was the beginning of the next year. I spent a week observing court-mandated therapy for convicted rapists, and that and the sort of question that story was like, could these men change and evolve? Could they learn empathy? I'm very mixed on how that sort of came out and how what the research points to, and whether it's sort of possible. I think here we're talking more about institutions than we are individuals, but at least currently, I am largely, I will say, like, there have been a few places where through private conversations, it seems like leadership has changed. And when leadership changes, things begin to change a little bit, but only when leadership changes. I do think it's sort of often, unfortunately, is not the answer people want to hear, but a burn it all down situation.
The next one is not so much a question, but kind of an affirmation of what you're doing, Eliana, that I think is important to read. So this reads, the assumption of parental involvement is completely errant. Maybe 20% are actively engaged. This person doesn't want to give out his or her name, but he or she is a Boy Scouts of America abuse survivor and claimant. He or she's representing himself or herself in the case right now. Eliana is dead on right now, completely. So anyway, I just wanted to read that. The next one is a question from Dr. Sandy Hessink, who is also a member of the Villanova University Task Force. Sandy writes, what is it that makes someone put the institution ahead of the welfare of the people the institution is supposed to serve?
Power. I think people have a hard time ceding power to other people. And keeping the status quo means keeping the power. So I think that, yeah, I think in a lot of cases, people worried that they'll be blamed. When we're talking about like people making sort of executive decision level decisions here, people worried that they'll be blamed. People worried that they'll be replaced. People worried that connections that they have established with people who are predators will hurt them in some way, or if that person is exposed, they'll lose an important connection in terms of retaining their power. I think, you know, we see this in politics often, and I think we're getting to a place where people are more willing to sort of acknowledge individual wrongdoing for the sake of protecting the people that they're supposed to serve. But I think it's just like a misalignment of priorities. And that's basically what it comes down to. Someone along the way forgot that the Boy Scouts are supposed to serve young boys, not the institution that, you know, was making money off of these programs. Ooh, sorry, I think you were on mute, so I missed that last.
Oh, sorry, Graham had just dipped into the back and I muted it and I forgot to unmute myself. So here we go again. This one is from Brooke, and she writes, what do you hope to see the Boy Scouts do in the future, or what do you feel would be a more appropriate response?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few things. One would be just establishing a more robust set of rules for how boys are going to be protected. They have talked about having sort of like checks, like there are 2 adults in the room at any given time. It's sort of unclear how that would be policed or monitored. And like a lot of parents have lost trust that even if they were to report something, like how it would make its way up the food chain and not be ignored, or just, you know, have a scout later move to another state, something like that. So I think, you know, a like more robust laying out of rules as to how they're going to protect children. 2, honestly, a lot of people would have to leave the organization, frankly. Like, I just think that there just needs to be different people running the organization for again, that trust to be reestablished. And I think the new people coming in to run the organization have to work really hard to establish that trust. I think that a lot of communication with the survivors and with the community would help a lot. And that seems like something in particular they're extremely hesitant to do. And you can understand why for PR reasons, but I don't think that the solution happens until that dialogue happens. And I don't think that reestablishment of trust happens until that dialogue happens. So, you know, I would like to see a lot more public engagement there. Frankly, personally, what I would like to see, again, Congress chartered the Boy Scouts of America. I would like to see more political figures involved in figuring out what went wrong, why Congress didn't know about it if they didn't, and sort of a reckoning there too, because this is like a government endorsed organization. And I think that largely some lawmakers have talked about it, but have largely sort of pushed the conflict away. And I would like to see a greater acknowledgement on that level as well.
Okay. Next question. This person writes, I am an Eagle Scout who became involved with Cub Scouts then Boy Scouts at 2 years old, and I was sexually assaulted by someone during a trip. It was mainly because I was openly gay. What would your opinion be on the culture stemming from homophobia being intersectional with the fragile masculinity that is rooted in the, I think it's bro culture?
Yeah. So I will start by saying that I have a lot of hope with the upcoming generation, Gen Z in particular, with dismantling a lot of the toxic culture that exists around our preconceptions of masculinity and femininity. So I do think that homophobia is used as a dangerous tool in two different aspects. One is to target boys who are perceived to be different than other boys in their scout troop, as I believe this person was saying. And I think that it's also used as a tool for shame, whether that's shaming somebody for being openly gay or whether that's shaming someone who is straight or doesn't know at that age what they are yet, or whatever their sexual preferences may be. Shame about the sort of stereotypes that we've built around, toxic stereotypes we've built around gay people in our culture, to shame them from sharing. So I think it's just multiple levels of shame working there. And I think, again, hopefully we are seeing a generation growing up that's frankly much more fluid, and is dismantling that bro culture that you're talking about. And, I've done some reporting on instances of assault in colleges, especially too. And, that's where you see that bro culture really flourish too. And which ends often in the abuse of both gay students and women students, and straight male students who are shamed for, again, using toxic gay stereotypes. So I think it's a major factor. While I say that, I think that we're becoming a culture that moves away from those stereotypes and, again, is much more fluid, I don't really, I don't know what to do about more, again, my New Yorkness might be showing here. I don't know what to do about more conservative enclaves where the Boy Scouts exist and thrive, where these types of toxic stereotypes, again, exist and thrive. There is a journalist who was an openly gay man who reported some of the first cases of sexual abuse that were very public a little over a decade ago. And he received death threats. He was harassed. There was a concerted effort specifically in this extremely religious community to essentially run him out of town. So I think that this works in many different levels. And the homophobia needs to end in order for that to stop being a tool of abuse.
Okay, good. You have time for 2 more questions, Eliana? Would that work? Okay, good. So this one reads, if the Boy Scouts have to liquidate all local councils and the national organization has to adequately compensate abuse survivors, which is estimated at somewhere around a little more or less than $5 billion, do you think it would be a significant loss to the country? Currently, the Boy Scouts of America has offered each survivor $6,100 in their plan of reorganization. That's essentially an offer of $100 million, right? None of the other parties believes that's anything but insulting.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's something bizarre about the entire I sort of do the like reporting process where I speak to victims about their experiences in hopes of elucidating a problem and starting a conversation about how to solve that problem. One of the avenues of solving that problem is lawsuits. Criminal lawsuits as a reporter make a lot more sense to me. Harvey Weinstein is convicted of raping victims. Harvey Weinstein goes to prison. The financial restitution is a more difficult subject for me to wrap my head around, because how on earth do you put a price on living with 60 years, for instance, of pain? And in the cases of some of the men I spoke to, it's hard to unpack how much to like blame and experience in someone's life on the direction that their life took. But I spoke to people who knew, for example, men who were abused in the Boy Scouts and then committed suicide. I spoke to people who abused drugs and traced some of that anguish that led them to drug abuse to their abuse as children. How do you put a number on the trajectory of somebody's life? So, I mean, personally, in my opinion, I definitely think that financial restitution for these victims is more important than the Boy Scouts owning some very nice, lucrative property where they host some of their camps, where they set up programs. I think that there is a way for the Boy Scouts to function without some of the assets that they own. But ultimately, both parties or a judge will determine what the division is there, and I don't envy anyone that job of assessing what that number is supposed to be.
Okay, good. Last question. Do you think that the overall value of the Boy Scouts of America program is worthless if the institution cannot deal with this issue?
I mean, I wouldn't send my child to the Boy Scouts of America now. So, yeah. If you can't trust sending your child somewhere, then what on earth, like, I don't want to weigh the benefits against the possible pitfalls of my child being abused. And I think that that's the decision that, without addressing the problems, the Boy Scouts are forcing parents to make. I think it's true of any institution where you're entrusting your children's safety. And I do think that the Boy Scouts I think that program does have inherent value. I don't think it has no value. I just think that it's really hard to weigh the benefits of that program against the safety of your own child. There's literally nothing more important. So ultimately, yeah, I think so. I don't think that it's unsalvageable. I also think that like a totally different organization could do all of these things safely. Like, it doesn't need to be the Boy Scouts, and it doesn't need to be the Boy Scouts rebranded with a new name. It can be a totally different institution that's built around fundamental values of not only safety, but equality and frankly dismantling a lot of the toxicity that allowed this sort of bro culture, this rite of passage abuse culture to build up, that allows for truthfulness and openness and brings parents into the community, as you were asking about earlier. I think that another organization could do that. Obviously, starting from scratch, from bomb up, is difficult, and they will not have the funding that the Boy Scouts of America did. But I think that there are valuable things that can exist without the people who turned a blind eye to this problem being the ones who are running the program.
Good. Eliana, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I wish you the best of luck in continuing to write on the Boy Scouts of America. And my hope is that what you're doing with the Boy Scouts will make children who want to participate in the Boy Scouts safe and sound. Just like what we're trying to do with the Task Force of Villanova will hopefully make children in Catholic institutions safe and sound. So good luck to you. We appreciate your time tonight, and thanks so much for all the attendees for coming and joining us tonight as well. Okay.
Thank you so
Good.
much for having me. This was a really great conversation.
You
Thank you for
betcha.
the really smart and great questions. And I wish I had answers to more of them as to how to solve this problem.
Good. All right. Thanks so much, Eliana. Thanks for joining us tonight too.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.